Y'all know that thing people say about the woods having ears? I used to think that was just something parents told kids to keep them from wandering off. A nice little metaphor. The forest is listening. Don't do anything you'd be ashamed of out there. But after reading these 3 accounts, I don't think it's a metaphor anymore. Because the woods don't just listen. Sometimes they talk back. And sometimes what comes out of them sounds exactly like someone you love. Our first story takes us to the Appalachian Trail, 2021. A solo hiker named Owen was setting up camp near the Smokies as evening came on. Not a rookie, experienced. The kind of guy who had done this trail sections before and knew the difference between the sounds a forest makes and the sounds it doesn't. That blue hour, you know it. When the light goes amber, then gray. When the shadows stop being shadows and start being something else entirely. Owen was hammering a tent stake into the ground when the whistle came. Not a random note, a specific tune, a melody Owen recognized immediately and completely. It was the whistle his father used to use to call the dogs back home at the end of the evening. 3 notes up, 2 down, the same every time. A sound so specific and personal that hearing it out here, in these mountains, in the fading light, stopped him cold. His father had been dead for 3 years. Owen sat very still, told himself what rational people tell themselves in moments like that. Wind through the pines can do strange things. The mountains create acoustics that don't make sense. There's always an explanation. Then he heard it a second time. Same tune, same 3 notes up, 2 down, closer now, and this time followed by a voice. Owen, dinner's ready. Not similar to his father's voice, not reminiscent of it. His father's voice, the exact cadence, the exact way he rounded the vowels, the specific warmth in it that Owen hadn't heard in 3 years and would have recognized anywhere on earth, coming from the dark tree line 30 feet away. Owen grabbed his bear spray, heart going hard. He called out, "Who's there?" And the forest went completely, instantly silent. The kind of silence that isn't natural. Like everything in those woods stopped at the same moment and held itself perfectly still. Then from behind a thick laurel thicket, his own voice shouted back, "Who's there?" His exact voice, his exact words played back to him from somewhere in that darkness 30 seconds after he'd spoken them. And then, because this wasn't frightening enough already, his own laughter started drifting out of those trees, low at first, then building, like something had learned the sound of Owen and was running through its whole collection. He didn't pack up, didn't grab most of his gear, just grabbed what was in his hands and ran. 2 solid miles through dark mountain trail to the nearest shelter. Didn't stop, didn't look back, though he told me later he heard it one more time as the shelter came into view ahead of him. His father's whistle, faint now, far behind him, like a goodbye. Owen spent that night in the shelter with 4 other hikers he'd never met. He told them what happened. 2 of them went quiet in a way that told him they'd heard stories like this before. One of them, a woman who had been hiking the Appalachians annually for 15 years, said she'd had her own name called from the tree line twice on this exact section of the trail. Different voice both times.
She said she had a rule. If you hear something in these mountains that sounds like someone you know, someone who shouldn't be out there, you don't answer it. You don't look toward it. You don't let it know it has your attention. Because once it knows you're listening, it doesn't stop. Owen never went back to that section of the trail. He hikes still, just not near the Smokies. And he told me the hardest part wasn't the fear of what was out there. It was how good it felt for just a split second before the reality landed to hear his father's voice again.
Now, here's where it gets under my skin even more. Because what happened to Owen, you can almost rationalize it. Remote trail, isolated man, grief playing tricks, the mountains doing what mountains do. But sometimes this thing, whatever it is, it doesn't stay out in the deep wilderness. Sometimes it follows you back. A woman named Claire lived in a cabin on the edge of the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. Not a vacation cabin, her actual home. She and her husband Tom had chosen it deliberately. The quiet, the trees, the distance from everything. Rainy Tuesday afternoon. The kind of gray, wet Pacific Northwest day where the forest blurs into the sky and everything feels close and muffled. Claire was in the kitchen. Tom was in the garage working on his truck. She could hear the faint sound of tools and the occasional country song drifting through the wall. Normal afternoon, completely normal. Then the back door creaked open. Tom's boots, that specific heavy thud she'd recognize anywhere, hit the hardwood floor of the hallway. "Hey, honey." His voice, completely his. "Can you help me with this box?" Claire started drying her hands on the dish towel, started heading toward the hallway, and then, just before she rounded the corner, something made her glance out the kitchen window. Tom's legs were sticking out from under the truck. He was in the driveway. He had been in the driveway the whole time. Tools clanking, right there, visible through the glass. Claire stood completely still, dish towel in her hands, looking at her husband's legs sticking out from under the truck, listening to the sound of heavy boots standing just around the corner in her hallway. "Sarah, I need help with the box." The voice again, perfect, patient, like it had all the time in the world, like it wasn't strange at all that it was standing in her hallway while the man it sounded like was 20 feet away underneath a vehicle. Claire did not answer, did not move toward the hallway. She backed up slowly to the kitchen door and locked it. Then she stood at the window and watched Tom work. For 10 minutes she stood there, listening to the house behind her go completely silent. When Tom finally slid out from under the truck and came in through the front, he found Claire standing in the kitchen, white as a sheet. He asked why the back door was locked. She told him. He checked the house immediately, every room, every closet. Nothing there. No sign of entry, no footprints inside the back door. Claire told me the worst part wasn't the voice. It was how natural it sounded, how perfectly timed, how it called her by name, her actual name, not a guess, and how it seemed to know that asking for help with a box was exactly the kind of mundane request that would get her moving without thinking. Whatever was in that hallway had been watching long enough to learn the rhythms of their life, the sound of Tom's boots, the specific way he called to her, the kinds of requests that made her move automatically.
It had been studying them, and it had come inside. She and Tom installed cameras the next week, motion sensors on every door. Tom started parking the truck in the garage, but Claire said, and this is the detail that lives in my head, on quiet evenings when Tom is somewhere else in the house and she hears his voice from another room, she still goes to the window first, just to check. 2 stories. Both about something that learns, that watches, that collects the sounds of the people around it until it can wear them like clothing. The 3rd story is different because it didn't involve adults making choices to go somewhere remote or live somewhere isolated. It involved a 6-year-old boy who went missing in the Pacific Northwest, and the search and rescue team that almost followed the wrong voice to find him.
This last account comes from a retired search and rescue officer, 22 years working remote forest extractions in the Pacific Northwest. A man who has seen genuinely terrible things in those woods and processed them professionally and moved on. He shared this once, in detail, and then said he didn't want to talk about it again. A 6-year-old boy had gone missing in a dense section of forest known for its ravines and disorienting terrain. The team had been searching since mid-morning. Sun was going down. They were 90 minutes from calling it for the night, which nobody wanted to do with a child still out there, when they heard it. Crying, a young boy sobbing, calling for his mom. The officer and his partner moved toward it immediately, calling the boy's name. The crying stopped, and a small, high-pitched voice said, "I'm over here, by the big rock." They reached the big rock, dense cedar trees on all sides, last light nearly gone. Nobody there.
The officer said he stood there for a moment, trying to process the empty space in front of him. His partner was already scanning the surrounding tree line with a flashlight, and that's when the officer looked up. Something tall was stepping behind a cedar tree at the far edge of the clearing, not walking away from them, stepping sideways, like it was removing itself from their line of sight deliberately, like it knew they were looking. He described it as gray, impossibly thin, the kind of proportions that don't work for any animal he'd ever encountered in 22 years of backcountry work, and where a face should have been, a smooth, pale surface, featureless, facing them anyway. Then from behind that cedar tree, the boy's voice again, but different now, slowed down, like a recording dragged to half speed. "I'm over here, Mom." Both officers backed away, hands on their sidearms. Nobody ran, training held, but they backed away from that clearing at a pace that the officer admitted to me was as close to running as his legs were capable of while technically still walking. They called in their position and resumed the search in the opposite direction.
They found the actual boy the following morning, 3 miles from that clearing, sitting under a fallen log eating berries, physically fine, calm in a way that surprised the rescuers. Most lost children that age are in complete distress after a night alone in the forest. They asked if he'd been scared. He shook his head. They asked if he'd cried for his mum. He said no. They asked why not. He thought about it for a second, the way 6-year-olds do when they're deciding how to explain something. And then he said, "The tall man told me to stay quiet. He said if I stayed quiet, everything would be okay." The officer asked what the tall man looked like. The boy said he was very tall, that he didn't have a regular face, that he stood near the fallen log all night and didn't move much, just stood there. The boy said he wasn't scared of the tall man, said the tall man seemed more interested in the people with the flashlights. The retired officer told me he has spent years trying to find a rational framework for what he saw in that clearing. Wildlife explanation, nothing in the Pacific Northwest matches those proportions. Optical illusion from failing light and stress, possible, except his partner saw the same thing and described it identically without them comparing notes first. He said what bothers him most, professionally, as someone who has spent a career in those forests, is the behavior, the deliberate stepping behind the tree, the mimicry of the child's voice, the apparent awareness of being observed. Whatever it was, it understood the situation. It understood that two adults with weapons were approaching. It had been using a child's voice to draw them in, and it stopped when they got close enough to see it properly. And it had spent the entire night standing next to a 6-year-old boy, keeping him quiet, keeping him calm, keeping him in one place. Not harming him, just keeping him there. The officer said he doesn't know what to do with that, whether it was protecting the boy or using him, whether those are even different things to whatever was standing in those trees. 3 stories tonight. 3 different corners of the American wilderness, and one thing running through all of them that I keep turning over in my head. Whatever does this, whatever lives out there in the old growth and the mountain hollows and the dense coastal forest, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't charge at you. It doesn't chase you down. It listens first, watches, learns the sounds that matter to you, the voice of someone you lost, the voice of the person sleeping down the hall, the sound of a child who needs help. And then it uses those sounds to see what you'll do. So here's the thing I'll leave you with tonight. If you're ever out in the American backcountry, the Appalachians, the Olympics, the Cascades, anywhere the old forest gets thick enough to swallow the light, and you hear a voice that shouldn't be there, a voice you recognize, calling your name. Don't answer it. Don't look toward it. Don't let it know it has your full attention. Because the one thing all 3 of these people learned the hard way is that once it knows you're listening, it doesn't stop calling.